The wedding of Aldrich Vane, Duke of Kalemore, to Lady Celestine Bramwell was everything that 4 seasons of careful negotiation and 2 family dynasties of accumulated expectation had promised it would be. The chapel at Kalemore Hall was dressed in white and gold. Guests filled the pews in order of precedence, and a certain quality of silence settled over everything, the kind that belongs to rooms full of people all pretending not to watch each other. Corinna Voss stood near the back. She had not planned to attend. Her brother Prentice had told her that her absence would attract more notice than her presence, and she had recognized, without pleasure, that he was right. So she had come. She had worn gray, taken a seat close to the door, and arrived late enough to avoid conversation. She had told herself 3 times during the carriage ride that she was perfectly composed. The third telling had worked no better than the first. Aldrich stood at the altar with his back straight and his face arranged in the careful stillness she had spent 5 years learning to read. He wore dark blue. He always wore dark blue. She had once remarked to Prentice that his closest friend dressed as though color had personally offended him, and Prentice had laughed, and she had turned to find Aldrich in the doorway and had never been quite certain how much he had heard. When Lady Celestine appeared at the far end of the aisle, Corinna rose with everyone else. She watched the bride move forward with the composed grace of a woman who had been told her entire life that this moment was exactly what she had been made for. The bishop waited. The words began. Corinna kept her hands folded and her breathing steady, and her expression one of pleasant, unreadable attention. She had made her decision 6 weeks ago in the garden at Voss House, standing in the dark after an evening she would not allow herself to think about, understanding at last, with that particular quiet and terrible clarity, that what she had permitted herself to feel for Aldrich Vane was hers alone to manage. She had come today to finish it, and she had intended to do exactly that. When remaining in the pew became impossible with any grace, she rose, moved into the aisle, and walked forward. She stopped before Lady Celestine Bramwell and inclined her head in a slow, deliberate bow. Not required, not demanded by any protocol, but honest in the only way she had remaining. An acknowledgement of what was, a release of what could not be. She straightened. She turned toward the door. She took one step, then another. Corinna. His voice did not rise. It did not break. It arrived in the chapel the way a single clear note arrives, carrying further than its volume should allow, and it stopped her before she completed the 3rd step. She stood with her back to the altar, and every guest in the room watching her, and the sound of her own name still present in the air between them. She had never once, in 5 years, heard him use it. Corinna. Again, quieter, almost careful. She turned. Aldrich Vane stood 3 steps below the altar. He had descended from it, in front of every significant family in the county, and one bishop who looked as though he was reconsidering the choices that had led him to this precise moment. And he was looking at her with the expression she had seen once, briefly, at a dinner 2 years ago, and had spent every effort since convincing herself she had misread entirely. She had not misread it. Lady Celestine stood behind him at the altar, her face composed in that particular way. Composure becomes visible only at its edges. She was not surprised, Corinna realized. Of everything in the room, that was the most unexpected thing. She was not surprised at all. The bishop had both hands folded and was looking at a point slightly above everyone's head. Prentice, 4 rows back, had gone completely still. "You were leaving," Aldrich said. "Yes," Corinna said. "I would like you to stay." She looked at him across the silent chapel and said, with the steadiness she had spent 6 weeks assembling, "That is a considerable thing to ask without a reason." "I have one," he said. "Then this," she said, with the smallest gesture toward the altar and the waiting bishop and the assembled guests and the bride, "is not the setting for it." "No," he agreed. He moved 1 step toward her. "But you were leaving." and I find I cannot allow it." She had known Aldrich Vane for 5 years, and for 4 of those 5 years, she had managed the knowing with what she considered admirable practicality. The first meeting had not been a meeting so much as a collision. Prentice had agreed to escort her to an appointment, and had then forgotten in the thorough way he forgot everything that did not concern horses or parliamentary reform. She had gone to his club in search of him, entering a room she was not supposed to enter, and had found a man by the fire with a brandy and the expression of someone who had never once done anything inadvisable in his carefully ordered life. He had told her women were not permitted in the room. She had told him someone should have mentioned that to her brother before he arranged to meet her there. He had looked at her with those dark blue eyes that disclosed precisely nothing and said, "You must be Corinna Voss. Prentice speaks of you with considerable patience." She had said that patience was Prentice's only virtue and also his primary failing. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression before he controlled it. She left the club thinking she found him entirely insupportable and would be content never to encounter him again. She encountered him 39 times in the first year. He was Prentice's closest friend, the kind of friendship that resisted external explanation and was proof against it. Aldrich came to Voss House for dinners, for cards, for the extended discussions about land management and parliamentary procedure that Prentice found invigorating and that Corinna found manageable only from the next room. He appeared at the same assemblies. He sat at the same dinner tables. He was not unkind in any manner that could be named directly. He was something more difficult than unkind. He was precise, and he paid attention to things with the thoroughness of someone who believed attention was a form of responsibility. And when he noticed something worth observing about her, he observed it aloud without apparent consideration for whether the observation was invited. He had corrected her once at a formal supper on a legal point she had cited with one detail wrong, in front of 8 other people, without malice, which made it considerably worse than malice would have been. He had intercepted a comment she had not directed at him at the Kelworth Assembly and told her that her argument was well constructed, but relied on an assumption that could not hold. She had said that unsolicited scrutiny was a habit she found exhausting. He had said she would find it less exhausting if she were wrong less frequently. She had told him she would take the matter under consideration and hoped never to speak with him again. Prentice had gone very red. Aldrich had looked at her with something that was not quite amusement, and was not quite anything she had a name for, and said nothing further. She had gone home more aware of him than when she had arrived, which was precisely the wrong direction. The shift that made all of it impossible had happened at the Ferngate dinner 2 years ago, when a storm had stretched the evening 4 hours past. Its intended conclusion and the cruelty of seating arrangements had placed her beside him for the duration. They had argued about enclosure policy and charitable endowment, and the question of whether hope or practicality was the more useful quality in a person. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, he had said that she was among the most interesting people he had spoken with in some time, in a very long time, and he had said it in the tone of someone reporting a finding they found moderately inconvenient. She had said she found that difficult to believe. He had said he found it rather difficult himself. She had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and the storm had said something against the windows, and she had understood with the specific misery of complete clarity that she was in very serious difficulty indeed. She had told herself for months that it would resolve. It did not resolve. It deepened in the way denied things deepen, growing denser rather than fading, until he was simply part of how she attended to a room, part of the sharpness with which she noticed certain conversations, part of everything she had decided at last to put down and leave behind. There had been a morning at Voss House, 3 months after the Ferngate dinner, when Aldrich had arrived to discuss an estate matter with Prentice and had found only her in the library, Prentice having gone out without leaving word. She had told him so, and he had turned to leave. And then he had stopped in the doorway and looked back and said, with the careful precision of someone who had considered a sentence for some time before saying it, "I read the paper you mentioned at the Kelworth Assembly. The one on drainage management. You were right. I was not. She had said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, I beg your pardon. You were right, he had said again. I should have said so at the time. And then he had left, before she could say anything further, and she had sat in the library for 20 minutes afterward, staring at the page she was no longer reading and telling herself with absolute firmness that it meant nothing at all. It had meant something. She simply had not permitted herself to know it yet. The Bramwell arrangement had been announced 8 months ago. Prentice had told her over breakfast, watching her face. She had said the match made every sensible kind of sense, had excused herself, and had walked in the garden at Voss House until she had finished feeling what she felt and could function again. She had attended the engagement dinner. She had been gracious to Lady Celestine. She had come to the wedding, and now she stood in the chapel aisle with Aldrich 3 steps away and the ceremony suspended around them. And she said, more quietly than she intended, Whatever you mean to say, you cannot say it here. No, he said, but I need to know you will not leave before I can. Behind him, Lady Celestine looked at Corinna across the length of the chapel, and what passed briefly across her face before she controlled it was not anger. It was something older and quieter than anger, something that looked almost like resignation, as though she had always known this moment was coming and had only ever been waiting to discover where it would happen. The guests did not leave quickly. There was no clear instruction and too much uncertainty for anyone to act with confidence. So they moved in clusters toward the doors with the compressed and bewildered energy of people who have witnessed something they do not yet have the language to describe and are already composing letters about it in their heads. The bishop withdrew to the vestibule with the senior Bramwell steward. The Duke of Cailmore's head housekeeper appeared at the side entrance with the expression of a woman who had managed crises before and was already working through the sequence of practical requirements this one would produce. Lady Celestine had been guided by her mother and 2 sisters into the small anteroom to the left of the altar, the 3 of them forming around her with the quiet efficiency of people who had prepared for contingencies. Lord Bramwell stood at the far end of the nave, speaking in low, emphatic tones, with 2 men Corinna did not recognize, and from the angle of the conversation and the set of his shoulders, it was clear that whatever was being said was not charitable. Prentice reached her before anyone else. He said under his breath, "Don't move." "I was not planning to move," she said. "I was planning to leave the county." "Corinna." "I know," she said. "I know." Aldrich crossed the chapel to her. He did not hurry. He walked the full length of the aisle with the composed deliberateness that was simply how he moved through everything. And he stopped 2 feet from where she stood, close enough to speak without being overheard, and far enough to observe every propriety that the situation, against all reason, still technically required. He looked at her steadily. "You stayed." "You asked me to," she said. "I have not yet decided if I ought to have." He accepted this without argument. His jaw was tight in the way it became tight when he was thinking through something he had not yet fully resolved. "I owe you an explanation. A complete one." "You owe several people a great deal more than that," she said, with a glance toward the anteroom. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." He looked toward the anteroom as well, and something moved across his face that was not comfortable to observe. "But there are things that must be said to you before anything else is said to anyone. I am asking you to remain at Cailmore Hall today, Corinna, until I have said them." She held his gaze for a long moment. Around them, the chapel continued its quiet dissolution, guests departing, staff moving with practiced efficiency through the aftermath of something no one had prepared a procedure for. "I will stay," she said at last, "until you have said what you need to say." She paused. "After that, I make no promises." "That is fair," he said. It was the first time in 5 years she could recall him conceding anything to her without qualification, and the plainness of it unsettled her more than an argument would have. She turned toward the door at the back of the chapel, where Prentice was waiting, his expression caught precisely between concern and something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, almost like relief. She had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that she was the only person in the chapel who had not known this was going to happen. And she was beginning to suspect, which was somehow worse than not knowing, that she was also the only person who did not yet understand what it meant now that it had. The drawing room to which Corinna had been guided by Prentice was on the east side of Kalemore Hall, a room she had been in twice before, both times at evening gatherings, where there had been enough people present that no one needed to look at anyone in particular. It was a well-furnished room, thoughtfully arranged, and it told her things about Aldrich that she had not given herself permission to notice before. The books on the side table were marked with slips of paper. The chairs were placed for conversation rather than display. The fire had been lit before any guest arrived that morning, which meant someone had been told to light it, which meant someone who lived in this house had thought ahead to the comfort of people who would be waiting in it. She was thinking about this, which was easier than thinking about anything else, when Crispin War appeared in the doorway. She had known Crispin War for 3 years, which was long enough to understand that he was charming in the specific way that required effort to sustain, and was therefore not entirely natural. He was the younger son of the Earl of Denver, pleasant-looking, socially accomplished, and attentive to Corinna in the particular manner of a man who had decided she was worth his attention without having yet decided precisely what that attention was meant to produce. He had danced with her at 4 separate events in the past season. He had sent flowers twice. He had said nothing direct and everything implied, and she had found him agreeable enough to tolerate and not interesting enough to think about. He looked now, crossing the drawing room toward her with his expression arranged in something between concern and relief, as though he had been searching for her and was glad to have found her. "Miss Voss," he said. "Are you all right? I have been looking everywhere. This whole business is, well..." He shook his head. "I can only imagine how distressing it must be for you." "I'm perfectly well," she said. He sat without being invited, in the chair closest to hers, and lowered his voice to the register that suggested confidentiality. "I wanted to make sure you had an escort, given the circumstances. If you would like to leave, I have my carriage here, and I would be very glad to see you home safely. You should not have to remain in this house a moment longer than you wish to." It was well said, considerate in its presentation, and entirely reasonable on its surface. She looked at him for a moment, and thought about what Prentice had told her once, that Crispin War paid his attentions most consistently to women whose circumstances had recently become complicated, because complicated circumstances had a way of making simple offers seem more attractive than they would otherwise appear. "That is very kind," she said, "but I have agreed to remain for a time." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, more like recalculation. "Agreed with whom, if I may ask?" "With the Duke," she said. The recalculation became more visible. He leaned forward slightly. "Corinna," he said, using her given name for the first time, which she noted. "Whatever he has told you, you do not owe this man anything. His behavior today has been extraordinary. If he has asked you to remain, the appropriate response is to decline." "I'm capable of determining the appropriate response myself," she said. "Of course you are." He smiled, and it was a good smile, easy and warm, and she could see exactly why it worked on most people. "I only mean that I am here, if you need anything." She became aware, at that moment, of Aldrich standing in the doorway. He was not looking at Crispin War in any dramatic fashion. He was simply standing there in the particular contained stillness of his, and his eyes were on Corinna, and whatever he was thinking was entirely invisible. He said, "Miss Voss, I am ready when you are." Crispin War rose from his chair and turned. The two men looked at each other with the surface pleasantness of men who are being very careful about something. "War," Aldrich said. "Kalemore," Crispin said. "I was just ensuring Miss Voss had everything she needed." She does, Aldrich said. He looked at Corinna, and the look was not possessive. It was something quieter than possessive, something that asked rather than claimed. And she rose from her chair, because the asking, somehow, was worse than a command would have been. She was nearly at the door when they heard Lord Bramwell's voice in the corridor outside, sharp and carrying and clearly past the point of discretion. I will not wait any longer, Kaelmore. You will face this now, in front of whoever is present. And you will explain to me, and to my daughter, and to every person who traveled to this county today and witnessed that disgrace, exactly what you intend to do about it. Corinna stopped. Aldrich's jaw tightened. He turned toward the corridor, and then he looked back at her once, briefly, and what she saw in his face in that single unguarded moment was not embarrassment, and not defiance, and not the practiced composure she had come to expect from him. It was something that looked, with a clarity that made her breath catch, very much like fear. The library at Kaelmore Hall was on the upper floor, reached by a staircase off the east corridor, and it was far enough from the main rooms that the sound of Lord Bramwell's voice did not carry there, which Corinna suspected was precisely why Aldrich had brought her to it. He had not answered Bramwell immediately. He had said, quietly and without raising his voice, that he would speak with Lord Bramwell within the hour, and that he would be grateful for the courtesy of that hour. Bramwell had not looked grateful. He had looked like a man who was measuring the precise limit of what he was willing to concede, and the answer was not much. But he had stepped back, and Prentice had guided Corinna up the stairs before anyone could say anything further. Now she stood in the library with its walls of ordered books and its single tall window overlooking the north lawn. And Aldrich stood 6 feet away near the fireplace, and Prentice had been persuaded, with difficulty, to wait outside the door. You said you had an explanation, Corinna said. I do, he said. Then I am listening. He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone composing a performance, but in the way of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times and is discovering, at the moment of delivery, that the rehearsal was for a different room entirely. I could not let you walk out of that chapel, he said. I know what it looked like. I know what it cost. I am not asking you to excuse any of it. I am only asking you to understand that I was watching you bow to Celestine, watching you do the graceful and generous and entirely unnecessary thing you were doing. And I understood in that moment something I should have understood a very long time ago. What did you understand? She asked. He looked at her. That I had been a coward. She had not expected that word. It did not fit with anything she knew about him, which was perhaps the point. In what regard? She said carefully. In every regard that concerned you. He moved to the window and looked out at the lawn, where a few remaining guests were still making their way to carriages. I told myself, for 4 years, that my feelings were irrelevant, that you were Prentice's sister, that my circumstances required a particular kind of match, and you were not that match, that I was being responsible. He paused. What I was actually being was afraid of something I had no precedent for wanting. The fire made a small sound behind her. She did not move. You treated me, she said, slowly, measuring each word, as though I were an inconvenience for most of those 4 years. Yes, he said. I did. You corrected me. You dismissed my opinions in public. You looked through me at gatherings, as though my presence required acknowledgement only when ignoring it would have been conspicuous. Yes. And now you are telling me that was because you were afraid. Yes, he turned from the window. I know how that sounds. It sounds, she said, like a very convenient way to reframe behavior that was unkind. It was unkind, he said. I am not asking you to call it anything else. Something crossed his face that was too raw to be comfortable to look at directly. Keeping distance from something you want very much can make you, I have discovered, rather unpleasant toward it. She studied him for a long moment, This man who had spent 5 years making her feel like a minor disruption in the margins of his more important life, and she felt, to her own surprise, something shift in the room between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first small crack in the particular wall she had built over 4 years of managing what she felt. It frightened her considerably, more than she wanted it to. "You are still engaged," she said, "or were this morning." "The engagement is over," he said. "It was over before today. I should have ended it months ago." "Why did you not?" He held her gaze. "Because ending it meant beginning something else. And beginning something else required a courage I was not certain I had." She opened her mouth to respond, and found she did not have the words immediately available, which was unusual enough to be alarming. "I am not asking you to feel anything you do not feel," he said. "I am asking only for the chance to say what should have been said a long time ago. The rest is yours to decide." She turned toward the window, because looking at him directly had become, in the last 2 minutes, something she needed to manage. She had said she needed air, which was true, and she had found her way to the narrow terrace off the upper corridor, which overlooked the south garden, and was cold enough in the late autumn afternoon to justify standing in it with her arms folded and her back to the house. Prentice found her there. He came and stood beside her without speaking, which was one of the things she valued most about him. "Did you know?" she asked finally. "I suspected," he said. "For about 2 years. You said nothing. You would not have thanked me for it." She considered this and found it was accurate. "He says he was afraid." "He was," Prentice said. "I watched it. It was not pleasant to watch." She turned to look at her brother. "And Celestine?" Prentice was quiet for a moment. "I think Celestine is a great deal more perceptive than anyone gave her credit for, including Aldrich." He paused. "The arrangement was her father's design. Whether she wanted it is a different question entirely." "She did not look surprised," Corinna said. "When he called my name, she did not look surprised at all." "No," Prentice said. "She did not." They stood together in the cold for a moment. Below them, the south garden was gray and still, the last of the autumn roses stripped by the previous week's wind down to bare canes. "Prentice," she said, "if he had told me, 2 years ago, plainly, if he had said what he said to me just now, would it have changed anything?" Her brother looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I think you already know the answer to that." She did, and that was precisely the problem. She turned back toward the house and found Aldrich standing in the terrace doorway, and behind him, over his shoulder, she could see Crispin War at the far end of the corridor, watching them both with an expression she did not like, and Lord Bramwell coming up the stairs behind him with the purposeful tread of a man who had decided that waiting was no longer something he was prepared to do. Lord Bramwell was not a subtle man in his anger. He came onto the terrace with his face flushed and his voice already at volume, and he looked at Corinna with an expression that made clear, without ambiguity, that in his accounting she was the source of everything that had gone wrong that morning. "I should like to know," he said, not to Aldrich, but directly to her, "what exactly you said to him, before the ceremony, or at any other time." "I said nothing to him," she said. "You walked to the front of that chapel and made a spectacle of yourself before my daughter, and whatever you intended, the effect was plain." "The effect of bowing to Lady Celestine," Corinna said, keeping her voice level, "was to acknowledge her. Nothing more. Lord Bramwell." Aldrich's voice arrived between them with the quiet authority of someone who did not need volume. "Whatever grievance you have today is with me. Miss Voss bears no responsibility for my choices." "Your choices," Bramwell repeated, turning to Aldrich, "have humiliated my family, broken an agreement made in good faith, and left my daughter at an altar before every family of consequence in this county. There will be consequences." "I am aware," Aldrich said. I am asking you, for Lady Celestine's sake more than my own, to consider whether a public account of today serves her interests." That landed. Bramwell's jaw tightened. "She deserves better than this," he said. Quieter. "Yes," Aldrich said. "She does. I will ensure she is not diminished by today. You have my word on that." Bramwell looked at him for a measuring moment. Then he looked at Corinna once more, with an expression that was not kind, and turned and went back down the stairs. The terrace was quiet. The cold pressed in from the garden below. Corinna waited until his footsteps had faded before she said, "You handled that well." "I handled the part that could be handled," Aldrich said. "The rest will follow us regardless." "Yes," she said. "It will." She turned to look at him directly, and the afternoon light was flat and gray on his face, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it directly." "Yes," he said. "When you ended things with Celestine in your mind, not the formal ending, the real one, the moment when you knew it was over, when was it?" He did not answer immediately. He looked out over the garden with that private stillness of his, and she waited, because she had learned by now that Aldrich's silences were not evasions. They were the sound of a man who would not say a thing until he was certain he could say it accurately. "The morning in your library," he said finally, "when I came back to tell you that you were right about the drainage paper." He paused. "You looked at me as though you were not certain whether to believe me, and I thought, standing in that doorway, that I had spent so long making myself difficult to believe that I had no right to be surprised when you found it difficult." He looked at her. "That was when I knew." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "You should have said something then." "I know." "Instead of waiting until today. Until the worst possible moment in the worst possible setting, with the worst possible consequences for everyone involved." "I know," he said again. "That is not an explanation, Aldrich. That is a confession. There is a difference." "Yes," he said quietly. "There is." He held her gaze. "And I am asking you, Corinna, for the chance to provide the explanation. Not today. Not in the middle of all of this. But before you leave. Before you go back to Voss House and decide that today was simply a disaster to be endured and forgotten." His voice was level, but the effort behind the levelness was visible. "Please." She turned back to the garden below and thought about the bow, about turning, about the fact that she had stayed when she could have left, and that the reason she had stayed was not, if she was honest with herself, entirely because he had asked her to. "We are out of time," Aldrich said, looking past her toward the corridor, where Crispin War still stood, watching with that quiet, calculating patience. "We have been out of time since this morning," she said. "Then tell me," he said, and his voice had lost the last of its composed surface entirely. "Tell me I have not ruined everything irreparably. Tell me there is something here worth what today has cost." She watched him and thought about 6 weeks of putting things down. About 4 years of managing and deciding and being sensible, and all of it had led her here, to a cold terrace in late autumn, standing across from a man who had just burned his own careful life to the ground and was asking her, with what remained of his composure, whether it had meant anything. "I have not decided yet," she said. "Ask me again when the smoke has cleared." She stepped past him into the corridor. Behind her, she heard Prentice exhale. Then, very quietly, he said, "That is either the worst answer or the best one." She was not certain yet which it was either. The last carriage left Kalemore Hall at 6:30 in the evening. Corinna knew this because she heard it from the upper corridor, the sound of wheels on gravel growing distant, and then gone, and the house settling into the quality of silence that follows a crowd, the way a held breath follows a loud noise. Prentice had gone an hour before to send word to Voss House and arrange a return carriage for the morning, which was the practical solution to the practical problem of her having arrived at the wedding in his vehicle, and his vehicle being needed elsewhere. He had told her she was welcome to come with him, and she had said she wasn't ready, and he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "I know," and had left. She was standing in the upper corridor with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed when she heard Aldrich's footsteps on the stairs. He stopped when he saw her. He was still in his wedding clothes, which sat on him with the faint indignity of a formal occasion that had not concluded the way it was arranged, and he looked at her with that expression she had been cataloging all day, the one with no name for it yet. "The house is yours until morning," he said. "Mrs. Aldgate has prepared a room in the East Wing." "I know," she said. "She told me." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you hungry? I realize there was no supper." "No," she said. "There was not." He nodded, slowly, as though the observation had confirmed something. "There is a fire in the small dining room, if you would." She considered declining. It would have been the sensible thing. It would have been the correct thing. She said, "Yes, all right." The small dining room was indeed small, with a table set for two by a window that looked onto the west garden, and a fire that had been going long enough to have taken the cold out of the room entirely. The food was simple: soup and bread and cold game, the kind of meal assembled by a kitchen that has been told to manage without a full complement of staff, and has done so with quiet competence. They ate for several minutes without speaking, which was different from their previous silences, in that this one was not hostile and not careful. It was simply the silence of two people who had spoken a great deal today and were deciding what came next. "How long had you been planning it?" she asked eventually. "Ending it. Before today." He set down his spoon. 3 months. "And you said nothing to anyone?" "I said something to my solicitor, regarding the financial arrangements." He looked at her. "I was not certain, for a long time, that I had the right to end it on the grounds I wanted to end it, whether wanting something was sufficient reason." "What grounds did you want to end it on?" He held her gaze. "On the grounds that I was in love with someone else, and had been for longer than was honest to conceal." She looked back at him, and let the sentence be what it was without retreating from it. "And you decided today that those were sufficient grounds." "I decided," he said, "when I watched you walk toward the door. When I understood what you were doing, and why, and realized that you had done the graceful and generous thing because you believed there was nothing else available to you." He paused. "I had taken every other option away from you, one by one, over 4 years, without ever saying why, and you had still found a way to be dignified about it." Something moved in his face. "I could not let that be how it ended." She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted behind her. "I had practiced it," she said finally. "The bow. I stood in my room at Voss House the night before, and I practiced it in front of the mirror because I wanted to be certain I could do it without my hands shaking." She looked down at her hands on the table. "They shook anyway." He said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "I know. I saw." She looked up. "You were watching." "I was always watching," he said. "That was rather the problem." They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, and the fire, and the small room, and all 4 years of it laid out between them with nowhere left to put it. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not say anything until I have finished." He nodded. "When I made that vow," she said, "it was not only for Celestine, it was for me. I made it because I needed to finish something inside myself that I had been not quite finishing for a very long time. I needed to make it real, the giving up of it, because it was not real yet, and I needed it to be." She paused. "I thought that if I could do it publicly, in front of everyone, with my hands steady and my head clear, then it would be over, and I could go home and be perfectly fine." "Were you?" he asked. "Going to be perfectly fine?" "No," she said, "but I was going to be functional." which is the most I was aiming for. He was quiet for a moment. How long? He said carefully. Have you felt this way? She considered the question in the honest way it deserved. 2 years, she said, since the Ferngate dinner. His expression shifted in a way that was complicated to read. Why did you say nothing? Because you were going to be a duke, she said, and I was Prentice's sister. And because you spent 4 years being comprehensively indifferent to me in public, and I had no reason, until that dinner, to believe the indifference was not genuine. She met his eyes. I made what I thought was the rational assessment of the available evidence. The available evidence, he said, with something in his voice that was almost rueful, was misleading in every particular. Yes, she said. I have gathered that. Though I will note that misleading evidence was something you constructed quite deliberately. I did, he said. I am sorry for it. I know you are. She looked at him steadily. That does not make it less true that you made me feel, for 4 years, like something that needed to be managed rather than known, like a problem adjacent to your actual life rather than a person in it. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I did, and I have no defense for it. That is not simply a restatement of my own fear. She nodded. The honesty of it was, she found, not easier to receive than she had expected. It was what she had wanted for 4 years, this specific admission, and receiving it was not clean. It was complicated in the way of things that arrive later than they should. They were quiet together for a while. Outside the window, the garden had gone dark entirely, and the only light in the room was the fire and the 2 candles on the table, and she was aware of the smallness of the room and the distance between them and the fact that neither of them was filling that distance or choosing to. When did you know? She asked. The actual moment, not the general understanding, but the specific one. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, the evening at the Kelworth assembly, the comment you made about the drainage question, the one I intercepted. He held her gaze. You turned when you heard my voice, and your expression was exactly what it always was when I came into a conversation uninvited, which was composed but briefly and visibly irritated. And I thought, standing there, that I would rather have you irritated with me than indifferent to me, that your irritation was more alive than anything else in the room. He paused. I spent the walk home from that assembly convincing myself that it was not what it was. I did not succeed. She held his gaze. You could have said something then. That was 3 years ago. I know. You had 3 years. Yes, he said quietly. I had 3 years, and I spent them being very precisely and carefully afraid, which is, I will admit, not an admirable use of 3 years. She shook her head, not in anger, but in the particular exhausted recognition of someone who has just been handed the full accounting. Aldrich. Yes. What do you want to happen now? He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the dark garden where the last light had fully gone. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, and she watched the line of his shoulders and thought about all the times she had watched him from across rooms and told herself she was not doing exactly that. I want to court you, he said. Properly and publicly, in whatever form that takes after today. I want to tell my father that I have made a decision, and that his approval, while I would welcome it, is not the condition of my proceeding. I want to stop spending my time managing the distance between us and spend it instead crossing it. He turned. I want you to know what it is like to have my full attention, not the attention that gets redirected whenever it becomes inconvenient, but the real kind, steady and unqualified. She held his gaze across the length of the room. Then she rose from her chair and walked toward him, not quickly, with the same deliberateness she had used walking down the chapel aisle that morning, and she stopped 2 feet from him and looked up at his face in the firelight. You had better mean that, she said. I mean every word of it, he said. She reached up and straightened the lapel of his coat, which did not need straightening, and the motion was small and entirely unnecessary, and it told them both something. He caught her hand as she drew it back and held it, not tightly, with the careful certainty of someone who is holding something they have waited a very long time to hold. Corinna, he said. I know, she said. He kissed her. It was not tentative, and it was not desperate, and it was nothing like a mistake. It was the kiss of a man who had made a decision and was enacting it with the same precision he brought to everything. And it was also, underneath all of that, the kiss of someone who had been afraid for 3 years and had stopped being afraid approximately 2 hours ago and was only now fully understanding what that meant. She kissed him back with equal deliberateness. Her hand was still in his. The fire said something quiet behind them. When they separated, she did not step away from him. He kept her hand. That, she said after a moment, was 4 years overdue. At minimum, he said. There was something in his voice she had never heard there before, an ease, a warmth that had always been present somewhere, but never permitted out where it could be observed. It suited him, she thought. It suited him rather enormously. This doesn't, she said carefully, resolve anything practical. No, he agreed. It resolves the one thing it resolves, and leaves everything else for tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be a complicated day. Yes, he said. It is. He met her eyes. But you will still be there at the end of it. It was not a question. She answered it anyway. Yes, she said. I will still be there. They stood in the small dining room of Kalemore Hall for a little while longer, with the fire burning low and the dark garden pressing gently at the window. And for the first time in 4 years, neither of them was managing anything at all. At some point the fire needed attention. He saw to it without releasing her hand. She found this unreasonably significant, and noted it in the specific way she had always noted things about him, with precision, and against her preference. I want to ask you something, he said, returning. Ask. If I had told you, at the Kelworth Assembly, if I had said, that evening, what I should have said, what would you have done? She considered the question with care. I would have been very suspicious, she said, for a considerable time. He accepted this. And then? And then, she said, I expect I would have been rather unreasonably happy. She looked at him. But I would have needed to be suspicious first. You had given me a great deal of evidence in the contrary direction. I had, he said. I am aware. The correction at the supper, she said. In front of 8 people. I know. The Kelworth Assembly comment. I know. The 3 separate occasions on which you told me my reasoning was sound, but my conclusion was wrong. To be fair, he said, with the careful tone of someone who knows they are on uncertain ground, in 2 of those 3 instances, the conclusion was in fact wrong. She looked at him. And the 3rd? He was quiet for a moment. I may have been less certain than I represented. She laughed. It was the real laugh, the one she could not manage, and he watched her when she laughed with the expression he had spent 4 years cataloging and had only in the last several hours finally understood. It was not indifference, and it had never been indifference. It was the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to show how much he was attending. You are going to be extremely difficult to be married to, she said, on account of always being approximately right. He looked at her with the warmth that was still new enough to be notable every time it appeared. Is that a proposal? It is, she said. A warning. I will take it, he said, under the same advisement as all the others. She looked out at the dark garden, at the window where the rain had started softly against the glass, and she thought that this was what 4 years of managing had been protecting against, this specific feeling, which was the feeling of being entirely known by someone and not minding at all. She came downstairs the following morning to find Aldrich already in the entrance hall, dressed for travel, and speaking with his estate steward in a low, rapid voice that suggested the conversation had been going on for some time. He saw her when she reached the foot of the stairs. He finished his sentence to the steward, who withdrew, and then he turned to her with an expression that had rearranged itself during the night into something she recognized and did not particularly welcome. It was his composed face, the careful one. "Good morning," he said. "I hope Mrs. Aldgate saw to everything you needed." "She did," Corinna said. "Thank you." He nodded. He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her for 4 years, the precise and contained way, and she felt the shift of it in her chest like a door closing. "Prentice has sent word," he said. "Your carriage will be here within the hour. There is breakfast in the morning room if you would like it before you leave." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Aldrich." "I have been thinking," he said, and his jaw was tight. "About last night. About what I permitted to happen. About what was appropriate given the circumstances, given everything that is unresolved, given that I have no right to, that it is not, that I should not have." He stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and said, "I should not have allowed it to go as far as it did." "You did not allow anything," she said steadily. "We both chose it, deliberately." "Yes," he said, "and I should not have." She studied him in the gray morning light, this man who had stood in the small dining room the night before and told her he wanted to court her properly and meant every word of it, and she saw on his face the thing she had always seen on it, the thing she had spent 4 years unable to correctly identify. It was not indifference. It had never been indifference. It was the face of someone who was profoundly afraid that if he reached for the thing he wanted, it would be taken from him, and so he had decided to reach for nothing. She understood it. She did not forgive it. "I see," she said. She pulled on her gloves with the same deliberateness she had brought to the bow yesterday. "I will wait for the carriage in the morning room." She walked past him. He did not call her back. The road from Kalemore back to Voss House was 2 hours in good weather, and the weather that morning was not good. Gray and cold with a persistent drizzle that was not quite rain, but soaked through everything regardless. Corinna sat in the Voss carriage with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the passing hedgerows, and told herself with complete conviction that she was not going to cry in a carriage over a man who had kissed her beside a fire, and then looked at her the next morning like a problem he had created by accident and was now trying to contain. She was very nearly succeeding when the carriage slowed and stopped on the road outside the village of Herne. She leaned to the window. Crispin War was on horseback in the middle of the road, one hand raised in greeting, his face arranged in that practiced expression of warm, undemanding concern. Her coachman exchanged a few words with him. Then the carriage door opened. "Miss Voss," Crispin said, with a smile that had clearly been prepared in advance. "What a fortunate coincidence. I was just coming from Denver and saw the Voss carriage. I wanted to make certain you were all right. Yesterday was, well, I'm perfectly well," she said. "As I told you yesterday." "Yes, of course." He glanced toward the coachman, then back at her, lowering his voice slightly. "I heard that you remained at Kalemore overnight." She met his eyes and let the silence work for a moment before answering. "I did. My carriage was not available." "I see." He paused in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed the next sentence. "Corinna, I am going to say something direct, and I hope you will take it in the spirit it is intended. People are already talking. The ceremony, the halt, your name being called in front of everyone. And now it will be known you stayed the night." He shook his head with an expression of great and carefully calibrated concern. "Kalemore has put you in a very difficult position. Whatever his intentions are, whatever he told you last night. You have no knowledge of what was said last night," she said. "No," he agreed smoothly. "But I know Aldrich Vane. I know his family, his obligations, the expectations his father has held for him since before either of us knew him. And I know that a man who halts his own wedding on impulse and then has an overnight guest the very same day is a man who does not yet know what he wants. He paused. Whereas I, he said, meeting her eyes with the particular directness of someone who has decided now is the moment, know exactly what I want. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Prentice had told her about him. She thought about the flowers and the dancing and the studied warmth of him, and the way he had appeared in the drawing room at Kalemore yesterday, like a man who had calculated his entrance. You are very kind, she said, and I mean it sincerely. But I am going to ask you something directly, and I would like a direct answer. Of course, he said. How long ago did you learn about my father's railway investments? The pause before his answer was brief, but present. I'm not certain what you mean. I think you are, she said. How long? Please. He looked at her for a moment with the charm still in place, and she watched it settle into something quieter and more honest, the expression of a man who has just been given accurate information about his own position and is deciding how to respond to it with some remaining dignity. 8 months, he said finally. 8 months, she said. Which was roughly when you began sending flowers. He said nothing. And the dancing, she said. And the letters. And yesterday, at Kalemore, positioning yourself as my advocate, while I was at my most vulnerable and least equipped to assess the motive behind the advocacy. She kept her voice level. It did not require effort. She had known the shape of this conversation since the road, had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment to walk into it directly. I appreciate the honesty. It took some doing to produce it. He looked at her with something that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. You are remarkably clear-eyed, he said, for someone who has just had a rather difficult 2 days. I have been clear-eyed about most things for most of my life, she said. I simply prefer not to use it as a weapon until it becomes necessary. She held his gaze. This has become necessary. I see that, he said. He straightened in the saddle, and there was a brief moment where the performance fell away entirely, and she saw what was underneath it, which was a man in a difficult position who had made some poor decisions about how to address it. She did not dislike him. She simply did not trust him. Good morning, Mr. War, she said. She nodded to the coachman. The carriage began to move. She did not look back. She sat with her hands folded for the rest of the journey and thought about 8 months, and about Aldrich's face that morning, and about the way the fire had looked in the small dining room the night before. And she was not at all certain of anything, except that she was more tired than she had ever been. And that being right about Crispin War brought her considerably less satisfaction than she had expected. She thought also about the morning retreat, about how she had come downstairs and seen Aldrich's face composed and careful, and had known immediately what it meant, because she had seen that face for 4 years and was very well acquainted with what it was doing when it looked like that. She had put on her gloves and told herself that she had known this was possible, had known it was likely, and that it was simply the next thing to be managed. But the honest truth, the one she had not said aloud, and was not certain she was ready to say aloud, was that the morning retreat had hurt in a way that was entirely different from the 4 years before it, because the 4 years before it, she had not known what she was missing. After the dining room, after the fire and the hand and the kiss, there was nothing like a mistake. She knew exactly what she was missing, which was considerably worse. She was not going to let it be permanent. She had decided that somewhere outside the village of Herne, watching Crispin War adjust his expression toward something more honest, and the decision had arrived with the quiet finality of things that are not really decisions at all, but recognitions of what you were always going to do. She was not going to practice another bow. Not for this. Voss House was warm and lit when the carriage arrived, which meant Prentice had come home before her and told their mother enough to warrant the drawing room fire being lit and the good tea service being used. Her mother met her at the door with the expression of a woman who has received partial information and is managing it bravely, which was among the more heroic things her mother regularly did. "My darling," her mother said, "come in. Sit down. Prentice has told us almost nothing, which means something has happened." Corinna sat down and accepted the tea and said, "Something has happened." Prentice appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with the quiet attention of someone who had been thinking about this all night and had arrived at several conclusions he was being patient about sharing. Her father came in after him and took the chair beside her mother and said nothing, which meant he already knew more than her mother and had decided to hear the rest before speaking. She told them. Not all of it. She told them what was necessary, which was more than she had told anyone since she had left Kalemore that morning, and she watched her parents' faces move through surprise and something more complicated than surprise, and she watched Prentice's face not move at all, because he had apparently suspected most of it for some time, and had the quality of a man receiving confirmation of a theory rather than news. When she had finished, her father was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire and then at her, and then at the fire again, which was how he had always thought through things that required real consideration rather than quick response. "And the Duke," he said at last. "What does he intend to do now?" "I do not know," she said. "This morning he seemed to be doing what he usually does when something becomes too real. He was managing it." "He has been managing things for a long time," Prentice said quietly. "Yes," she said. "And I am not certain how much longer I am willing to wait for him to stop." Her father looked at her steadily. He had a face that made assessments without announcing them, and he used it now. "Corinna," he said, "what do you want?" She looked at her hands in her lap, at the gloves she had put on that morning with such deliberate composure. "I want to not have to choose between my dignity and the truth," she said. "I have been choosing between them for 4 years, and I am rather tired of it." Her father nodded slowly. Her mother, who had been very quiet, reached across and took her hand. "Then do not," her mother said simply. Corinna looked at her. Her mother had a way of reducing things to their essential shape that was occasionally infuriating, and, at present, something close to the most useful thing anyone had said to her in 24 hours. "No," she said after a moment. "I do not suppose I should." 3 days passed. Corinna moved through them with the quality of attention that belongs to people who are waiting for something to happen and are not certain what form it will take when it does. She read. She walked. She had 2 conversations with Prentice that covered the ground of what had occurred from different angles without arriving at any new destinations. She told herself each morning that she had made the decisions available to her and that whatever came next was not in her hands. On the 4th morning, a letter arrived. It was from Aldrich. She recognized the handwriting before she turned it over, and she held it for a moment before opening it, in the way one holds a thing that might change the shape of the day. "Dear Miss Voss," she read, "I have been composing this letter in my head since you left Kalemore, and each version I have written has been shorter than the last, because I have been trying to find the precise sentence that says what needs to be said without saying more than I have the right to say, and I have concluded that this approach produces letters that are accurate, but not honest, and you deserve honesty above accuracy. I was wrong on Wednesday morning, not about what happened the night before. That was the truest thing that has occurred in this house in a long time, and I will not call it a mistake, even to protect myself from the consequences of admitting it was real. I was wrong about what I said when I saw you on the stairs. I was afraid. I have been afraid for 3 years, and I was afraid again at the first available moment, which is precisely the pattern you have every right to be tired of. I ended my courtship with Celestine 3 months ago in my own mind, and formally, I have spoken with Bramwell's solicitor this week. The arrangement is dissolved. There are consequences to face. None of them are your concern or your responsibility. I am not writing to ask you for anything. I am writing because I told you in the library that you deserved honesty, and honesty includes this. I meant what I said in the dining room. All of it. The question of what to do with that is entirely yours. I will not press. I will not arrange. I will simply be available if you decide there is something here worth the difficulty of it. Vane. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in her writing desk and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and thought that it was the most honest thing he had ever written to her, and also that he had still managed to leave the next step entirely to her, which was either cowardice or courtesy, and she had not yet determined which. She was still deciding when Prentice knocked and entered, which meant it was urgent. "Crispin War has written to Father," he said. "I thought you should know before Father speaks to you about it." She closed her eyes briefly. "What does it say?" "He has been subtle about it. He implies, without stating directly, that your reputation may have been compromised by the overnight stay at Kalemore. He phrases it as concern. He mentions in passing that he would be glad to speak in your defense if anything were to be questioned." Prentice paused. "It is not a threat. It is the outline of one. He is hoping Father will decide the simplest solution is to accept him," she said. "Yes," Prentice said. "He is reasonably good at identifying when people are in a position to accept simple solutions." She stood up. She picked up Aldrich's letter from her writing desk and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it down again. "Prentice," she said. "Yes. I am going to need the carriage." She found Crispin War, not because she had difficulty locating him, but because he had left sufficient indication of his movements over the past 3 days that finding him required only the application of moderate effort, which itself told her something about his expectation of being found. He was at his club in the city, lunching with 2 other men she recognized as belonging to the outer edge of his social circle, men whose presence suggested an audience as much as company. He rose when he saw her come in, which was not something men typically did for women in this particular room, which meant he had prepared for her arrival, which confirmed the rest of it. "Miss Voss," he said, with the warmth that was his best instrument. What a pleasant surprise. "It is not a surprise," she said, "and I would like a word privately, if you will excuse yourself from your friends." He excused himself, with the smooth grace of a man who was pleased things were proceeding according to plan, and followed her to a small adjacent sitting room where no one could hear them well. "I want to be direct," she said. "The letter you sent my father was a thinly constructed threat, and I imagine you know that I know that." He tilted his head slightly, a small recalibration. "It was a letter expressing concern, which is all it was." "Then I am sure you will have no objection to withdrawing the implication," she said, clearly and in writing, "to my father, within the week." "That seems," he said carefully, "rather a lot to ask." "It seems rather a lot," she agreed. "Crispin, you are not a bad man. I do not think you are. I think you are a man in a difficult financial position who has become very skilled at identifying opportunities and is sometimes unable to see when an opportunity is actually a person." She looked at him steadily. "I am a person, not an opportunity. And if you write a single further word that touches my reputation or implies a compromise that did not occur, I will tell every woman of my acquaintance, which is rather a lot of them, exactly what I know about your family's financial situation and the calculations behind your courtship behavior, not out of malice, out of clarity." He regarded her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, past the charm and the recalculation, to something that was almost candid. "You are," he said at last, "remarkably difficult to manage." "Yes," she said, "I have been told." She left him there and walked out into the cold afternoon, and she had been on the pavement for approximately 45 seconds when she became aware of Aldrich standing a few feet away, looking at her with an expression she had long since given up trying to categorize. "I followed the carriage," he said, "from Voss House." She looked at him. You followed the carriage. I had come to speak to Prentice. He told me where you had gone and why. He glanced toward the club door. What did you say to him? I told him to withdraw the letter, she said, and I told him what would happen if he did not. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. On your own? Yes, on my own. She looked at him with a steadiness that was neither warm nor cold, but simply direct. I have been handling things on my own for some time, Aldrich. I am rather competent at it. She paused. Though I will note that it would have been considerably simpler to handle if a letter had not been required in the first place. A letter being required in the first place, being a direct consequence of the morning retreat from Kalemore Hall, which was itself a direct consequence of 4 years of not saying what needed to be said. She tilted her head slightly. I am not angry. I want to be accurate. He held her gaze and did not flinch from the accuracy of it. You are right, he said. Every part of that is right. I know, she said. Was there something you came to say? Something beyond following my carriage across the city? He saw her standing there in the gray afternoon, composed and direct and rather magnificent, and he said, Yes, there is. She waited. I have been afraid, he said, for 4 years, and I was afraid on Wednesday morning, and I wrote you a letter yesterday that was honest about the fear, but that still, somehow, managed to leave the burden of the next step with you, which is exactly what I have been doing for 4 years, and I am done doing it. She said nothing. I am asking to court you, he said, formally, with Prentice's knowledge, in full view of everyone, beginning immediately, not contingent on my father's approval, not qualified by any consideration of what is convenient for my circumstances. He took a step toward her. I am asking because I want to, not because the situation has forced my hand. Because there is a difference between being driven toward something by circumstance and choosing it with a full understanding of what it costs, and I want you to know that I understand exactly what this costs, and I am choosing it anyway. She regarded him for a long moment in the gray afternoon, on a pavement outside a club in the city, which was not a setting either of them would have chosen, but which was, she reflected, rather aptly theirs. You followed my carriage, she said. I did. Across the city. Yes. To tell me that. Yes, he said. And then, very quietly, I was not going to let you handle war alone. And I was not going to write you another careful letter. And I was not going to wait until I had everything resolved and managed and arranged before I said what I should have said 4 years ago. He was close now, close enough to speak quietly, close enough that the people passing on the pavement behind them could observe without hearing. I should have told you at the Ferngate dinner. I should have told you when I came back to say you were right about the paper. I should have told you the morning of the wedding, before you ever had to go and practice that bow in front of a mirror. Her breath caught. You were not supposed to know about that, she said. Prentice told me, he said. This morning, he said I should know exactly what my cowardice had cost you, and that I should decide accordingly. He met her eyes. I have decided. She held his gaze for a long moment. The pavement was cold. The afternoon was gray. None of it was romantic in any conventional sense, and she thought that it was, nonetheless, somehow, exactly right. Prentice is going to be insufferable about this, she said. Something broke open in his face, that warmth she had seen once in the small dining room by the fire. Yes, he said. He absolutely is. She gave him her hand. Prentice was in his study at Voss House when they came in together. He looked up, looked at their joined hands, and looked back at Aldrich with an expression that combined the concern of a brother, the assessment of a friend of 15 years, and the quiet satisfaction of a man whose theory had just been confirmed. I'm going to ask you something, Prentice said, and I want an honest answer. Yes, Aldrich said. Are you here because the situation has pushed you into it, or because you want to be here? I want to be here, Aldrich said. I have wanted to be here for 3 years. I handled it very badly for most of that time, and I intend to spend a considerable period making up for the handling." Prentice looked at his sister. "And you?" "I want him here," she said. "Though I reserve the right to tell him when he is being an idiot, which, based on available evidence, will be with some frequency." Prentice looked between them for a long moment. He stood up. "Aldrich," he said, "I have known you for 15 years, and there have been moments, particularly in the last 4, when I have found your behavior toward my sister difficult to watch. You know that." "I know that," Aldrich said. "I am going to give you my blessing to court her, because she is standing there with her hand in yours, and she looks, for the first time in about 2 years, like herself. Like the version of herself that does not have anything being managed." He paused. "But I will tell you directly that if you manage her again, if you retreat or recalculate or get afraid and make her feel like a problem, you and I will have a very different conversation. The kind that does not end with a handshake." "Understood," Aldrich said. "Good." Prentice held his gaze for a moment longer, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for 15 years to say something and has finally found the occasion. "I am glad it is you," he said quietly. "I have been glad it was you for some time. I just needed you to arrive at the same conclusion without my assistance." Rick looked at him. "You could have assisted." "I could have," Prentice said. "But you needed to do it yourself. Both of you did." He looked at his sister. "Did you not?" She turned to Prentice, who had said almost nothing for 4 years, and had apparently understood everything. And she said, "Yes, we did." Prentice nodded. He came around the desk and clasped Aldrich by the shoulder, in the way of men who have been friends for 15 years, and have arrived, by a very long route, at a place they probably should have arrived at sooner. "Good," he said. "Now, what are we going to do about Father Bramwell and the whisper campaign he has apparently already started?" "We are going to do nothing," Aldrich said. "I am going to be very visible, very consistent, and very public in how I treat your sister, and Bramwell will find that the whisper campaign runs out of fuel when there is nothing to burn." Prentice considered this. "And your father?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "My father and I are going to have a conversation that has been overdue for some time. I do not expect it to be comfortable. I expect it to be necessary." "When?" "Tomorrow," he said. "First thing." Corinna looked at him standing there in her brother's study, talking about his father with the steady certainty of a man who has made up his mind and is proceeding accordingly. And she thought about the chapel yesterday, and the library, and the dining room, and the pavement, and all of it, the long road of it, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. The conversation with Aldrich's father lasted 2 hours. Aldrich described it to Corinna afterward, with the precision of someone who had survived something by keeping a very clear account of it. His father had been furious. He had cited the Bramwell arrangement, the family's reputation, the expectations of a dukedom, and the responsibilities of inheritance. He had said things that were intended to wound, and several of them had hit their mark. Aldrich had listened to all of it, and at the end, he had said, simply, that he understood his father's position entirely, and that he was going to court Corinna Voss with his permission if possible, and without it if necessary, and that he would be grateful to have the conversation again in 6 months, when the initial feeling had settled. His father had not spoken to him for a week, but he had not disowned him, and after the week, he had sent a brief note that said nothing particularly warm, but contained, in its final line, the phrase, "Do not embarrass the family further," which was, Prentice observed, as close to a conditional approval as the man was capable of producing. Corinna had written a brief reply to the Duke that Aldrich had not seen before she sent it. He had asked afterward what it said. She told him she had thanked his father for his restraint, acknowledged the difficulty of his position, and expressed the hope that they might come to know each other better in time. Aldrich had looked at her for a long moment and said that was either very wise or very bold. She had said it was neither. It was simply what was true. The rest of it was what it was. People talked. They talked for several weeks with considerable energy about the Halted wedding and the overnight stay and the broken Bramwell arrangement. And Corinna's name was attached to words she found unpleasant, and Aldrich's was attached to words he found inaccurate. And through all of it, Aldrich was precisely what he had said he would be. Present, consistent, visible. He called every day at the approved hours. He stood beside her at every social occasion, and when people whispered in her direction, he looked at them with the particular quality of attention that communicated, without requiring words, that he had noticed, and that they should consider carefully whether they wished to continue. Slowly, the way that storms exhaust themselves eventually, the talking moved on to other things, because Aldrich Vane was the heir to a significant dukedom, and he was publicly, plainly, and with apparent deep conviction choosing Corinna Voss, and society, which was fundamentally a practical institution, had to account for that. The proposal came 4 months later, in the drawing room at Voss House, with her parents present, and Prentice standing in the doorway doing a mediocre job of pretending he had not arranged to be there. He got down on one knee and asked her to marry him, formally, and without qualification, and she said yes, and her mother made a sound, and Prentice said something under his breath that made her father laugh. They were married in the spring, at the small church near Voss House, in a ceremony that was the precise opposite of the Kalemore Chapel, in every respect, except that Aldrich was at the altar, and Corinna was walking toward him. Prentice stood to one side, and their parents sat in the front pew, and the morning light came through the old windows in long, pale columns across the stone floor. And this time, no one called her name before she reached him, because this time, there was nowhere else she was trying to go, and they both knew it. 2 years later, on a morning in early autumn, Corinna was in the garden at Kalemore Hall when Aldrich came looking for her. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps on the gravel path, the particular cadence of them that she knew now the way she knew most things about him, not because she had studied it, but because it had become part of how she moved through the world. "You have been out here for an hour," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the west end of the garden, where the rose canes stood bare against the stone wall. "About the day of the wedding. Your wedding. The one that did not happen." She turned to look at him. "I stood on the terrace and looked at those canes, and thought about whether I would be here to see them in the spring." He stood beside her and looked at them. "Were you certain you would not be?" "Yes," she said. "I had been quite thorough about the certainty." "And yet," he said. "And yet," she said, "here I am." She looked at the canes, and then at him, and thought that some of the best things in her life had arrived through the side entrance of something else entirely, through a halted ceremony and a cold terrace, and a pavement in the city. "Here we both are," she added. He took her hand in his, which he did often, not for display, but because it was available, and he had decided, some time ago, to stop not taking the things that were available to him. "I have thought about what you said," he told her, "about practicing the bow." "Have you?" "Rather often." He looked at her. "I think about you standing in your room the night before, alone, practicing the most graceful version of giving me up, because you had decided there was no other option." He paused. "And I think about the fact that I could have told you at any point in the preceding 2 years that there was another option. And I chose not to, because I was afraid." "You have apologized for that," she said. "Several times." "I know," he said, "but I want to remember it clearly, because it was the closest thing I have ever done to the worst thing I can imagine doing. And I want to make certain I never do anything like it again." She looked at him in the early autumn light, more himself than she had ever seen him in the years before, and said, You are not afraid anymore." "No," he said. "I am not." He looked at her. "You want to know what changed?" "I already know," she said. "You told me on the pavement." "Tell me again," he said. "I like hearing it." She smiled. "You followed my carriage across the city and decided that was the answer to the question you had been asking yourself for 4 years." "Yes," he said. "And before that, you turned around in the chapel. You turned around when I called your name, and your face told me that you had not fully closed everything off yet." He met her eyes. I understood that fear had cost me 3 years of something real, and that if I let it cost me one more day, I did not deserve the thing I was afraid of losing. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "The bow," she said. "I meant it when I made it. I was truly trying to let go." She looked at him steadily. "But the very first step I took toward the door, I was already hoping you would stop me. I had been hoping it for 4 years. I had simply decided, finally, to stop waiting for it and go." He held her gaze. "And then I stopped you." "And then you stopped you," she said. "So here we are." He pulled her gently toward him, and she went without hesitation, because this was the difference between then and now, between the managing and the not managing, between the person she had been in that gray silk near the back of the chapel and the person she was now, in this garden, in this life. She had practiced the letting go so carefully, and it had not been needed. What had been needed was much simpler. 2 people who loved each other, each waiting for the other to be brave enough first. She had been walking toward this for 4 years. She was glad every morning that she had turned around when he called her name. Not because she had no choice, because she had always had a choice. And this one, she would not have missed for anything in the world. If this story stayed with you, if you held your breath in that chapel doorway waiting to see whether she would turn, then you already understand what it is really about. It is not about a ceremony. It is about the moment you stop performing the graceful surrender and admit to yourself and to the person who has been watching you from across rooms that you still want the thing you were trying to put down. Thank you for being here. There are more stories coming. Subscribe and ring the bell. We will be here when they do.